Hi guys, I'm Mahak.
I'm Seraphine.
I'm Shilpa.
I'm Chloe.
And today we're talking about Postcolonial Banter by Suhaiymah Manzoor-Khan. So specifically, we're going to be talking about one of her poems called Recipe for a War on Terror. I'll read you guys the first few lines. So, whilst there are many steps to this recipe, you really need only one ingredient, terror. The problem is that this ingredient cannot be found naturally, so you will have to make it first to go to war with it. So essentially the concept of this poem is she's talking about how a lot of different countries, when they wage wars in the Middle East, which they a lot of the time label as operations for enduring freedom, what they do is they manipulate their people into thinking these people that they go to war with are terrorists, or they're oppressing women, or oppressing the LGBTQ community. And so they create a fear in their own community that allows them to say, hey, we're going to go to these countries and we're going to liberate all these people from the Taliban or the Islamic regime, etc., etc. It was a really interesting concept the way she wrote it, which was basically in the form of a recipe.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the author's background. So she was born and raised in England to second-generation British Pakistani parents, and right now she identifies as a British Muslim writer, poet, and educator with a focus on history, race, political knowledge, and violence. And she has three published books, I think. I think she co-wrote one of them. She's actually a spoken word poet, so I thought it was really interesting that she actually has 3 books, because I think originally they started as actually spoken word, and then she wrote them down. And I found an interview where she talks about why she wrote them down, and she said that when she studied history, which she did at University of Cambridge, I think, she got a bachelor's in history, she said she became very aware of the biases of the archives, so research stuff. And she was like, what counts as a historical document and what gets to go in the archive. She said that she has an obsession with keeping and having factual historical evidence, which is also really interesting because she's an active member of some research collective.
Just to add in there, it's also really interesting to know that she has a passion for collecting all these documents and stuff, because one of the really interesting parts about her poetry books is these context boxes, which she puts in not at the end of all of her poems, but at the end of a lot of them. She mentioned that most of these poems in Postcolonial Banter were only ever read and spoken aloud by her, so she wanted to be able to kind of clarify, extend, and contextualize to the audience what she was talking about in her poems. And you can see a lot of them have citations of these books that she likes to keep with her.
Yeah, so she's part of a research collective, and I didn't know what a research collective was until I saw this, but apparently it's literally a group of people who get together to do research. It's like a book club.
Nerdy.
Yeah, it's
That's even nerdier than book clubs. That's even nerdier than this.
So for the last seven-ish years, she's been lecturing and doing a lot of political education workshops while continuing her own social advocacy. And she's been invited to write and speak at TED Talks and stuff. But yeah, she got her bachelor's in history from Cambridge and a master's in post-colonial studies from SOAS University of London. And the most interesting part of all of this is that her thesis was about how Muslims, especially Pakistanis, are targets of the British surveillance state, which is the whole network of cameras and stuff in the UK.
Dang.
As Mahak mentioned earlier, one of the most glaring theme in this poem is the use of power and propaganda to manipulate people. The poem discusses how to successfully start a war, and one of the requiring things is a lot of people of the country in order to get them to act as wanted. Throughout the poem, lines are used such as suggest your involvement is intervention, and use words like freedom and liberty to make the blow seem less hard. So by altering the word choice to be less threatening, it manipulates the people of the country by making them believe that there's good motivation behind the actions, that they're freeing, like Mahak said earlier, they're freeing the people that they're starting the war with instead of being violent. And also throughout the poem there's a repetition of the line, hopefully no one will question the logic. And it shows the manipulation is a conscious effort to gain control over the citizens, and the poem reflects something frequently seen in real life. Citizens are manipulated to believe their leader is doing what's best for them, even if they aren't.
So that kind of directly relates into what I wanted to talk about, which is some of the more technical aspects of the poem. Chloe mentioned the line, hopefully no one will question this logic, is repeated throughout the poem. And so it actually creates one of the most eye-catching aspects, according to me, especially because this poem originally started out as like a spoken word poem. So there's a rhythm which is created by the structure of it. As in the title, it's written in the form of a recipe, steps and all, and so even though that does contribute to like the flow of the poem when you speak it aloud, the driver of the rhythm is that repeating phrase, hopefully no one will question this logic. It's really focal to the poet's perspective as it drives home the point of her poem, which is obviously that she is questioning this logic. Each time she explains the next step in creating this war on terror, or Operation Enduring Freedom, which is actually what Bush called his operation when he invaded Afghanistan, she goes back and she says, hopefully no one will question this logic. So it's actually very clearly satirical because, as explained at the beginning, many have caught on to this false logic. One of the examples where you can actually see this logic being questioned is when she explains that Iraq violated Iran's territorial integrity in the 1980s, but this wasn't actually deemed a violation because it aided the USA's geopolitical goals in the area, which was like curbing Iranian power due to the Iranian Revolution, or like after the Iranian Revolution. But when Iraq invaded Kuwait in the 1990s, it was then deemed a violation and led to US-led military assault, which is now suited to the USA's geopolitical goals in that area at that time. Basically, the most important aspect of the way Suhaiymah uses rhythm and structure is how like it adds to all of her arguments, propelling forth themes such as such as Chloe mentioned, like the use of political propaganda, and like it propagates her explanations of liberating all these people in Muslim countries, even though, you know, they don't actually need to be liberated.
Yeah. For me, the main thing that I felt like she was talking about a lot was the propaganda. Kind of what she explained in the context was a lot of the reason why she wanted to write the poem was to display the real reasons behind like the political reasoning of the government. So I thought that was really interesting. Like I feel like a lot of the stuff I didn't know in depth without like doing research, because you just kind of believe what you're told. Even in countries in the US where people think, oh, we're free, we don't have censorship, we're not like those countries that like, you know, are so tightly controlled. It's true, like we still have a lot of propaganda and like cover-ups by the government, and I think it's like something that we should like be aware with. So I thought that.
And even when she was saying like, hopefully no one will question this logic, I feel like the part where she really delves into like, for example, violations of gay rights and women's rights in like Muslim countries. It was like the original reason like the US was so easily able to go in and invade Afghanistan, and like even now when the US was pulling out of Afghanistan, a lot of people were saying, oh, but like you're leaving all these people behind, and like what about you used to say like the Taliban was gonna impeach on women's rights and stuff like that. So it was really interesting because there's like relevant recent examples as well.
Yeah. I think it's weird that people went into the whole, oh, we're freeing them from this. Like, it's kind of weird.
Told.
Yeah, it's kind of like it's like the colonial thing of like when people came to Africa to like help them become civilized or like show them religion.
You're right.
Know? That's why it's Postcolonial Banter.
Okay.
And there was another thing that I thought was really interesting that has to do with the structure of it, which is that all of the steps actually kind of make references in chronological order to real life events. So like the first one has to do with a program that was funded by the CIA, and then a later step references something that was set up by the UK and the US. I forgot what it's called. So everything in the poem is really real, even though she's delivering it in like concise form. Like each detail, each reference is a real thing that has actually happened.
And she's delivering it in like such a satirical way, but like it's still like really knowledgeable.
I think my favorite thing was, or I don't know if she explicitly stated it, but how it was like, the title is Postcolonial Banter, right? Mm-hmm. And then what they were doing there was like a modern colonialism thing. Like they were going there to liberate the people and to like show them these U.S. values, which is something that the U.S. does a lot.
Nice. I really like the approach she used, discussing such like controversial topics and such like deep topics in such a satirical way, and like it's like a big juxtaposition between like the delivery and the content itself. Like I think it makes it more interesting to read.
And it was also really easy to read because a lot of the time I'm like, oh, I'm definitely going to read this book because it's talking about like the topic that I'm interested in, and I'm like, I'll be an intellectual. But actually, they're really, I'm sorry if you like these kind of books, but they're like, they take so much effort to sit down and read. But with this one, I learned so much in like such an easy manner. Like, 'cause she didn't write it in like a difficult to read way, or a way where you really have to sit down and like decipher her words. But then she also did those context boxes at the end if you were like wanted to go and learn more. Like you could even just read that where she put citations so that you can find it like on your own.
It was like digestible.
Yeah,
I think that's the word. Yeah, right. I did think that was important. A lot of times, like intellectual like books and stuff like that are just not accessible because they don't like flow as well, and you really do like you feel like you're reading a textbook. I would recommend it a 4 out of 5 stars, just because it can be lengthy at times. There's a lot of information, but that's also part of what makes it really good. There's a lot of things to digest.
I'd say 4 out of 5 because I liked how she had the context boxes. Those are really interesting, and also she comes from like a bit of a different perspective than these poems would usually be written from, because she's not just Pakistani, like she's British Pakistani and like third generation. So she has this like more modern outlook on everything that's happening, and if you read about all the things that she's done, it's a lot. Like she's actively doing so many things that are not entirely, like she's not entirely exposed to all that stuff because she grew up in England, and I think she still lives in England. So I think like that effort shows. And I also like that it's spoken word, but it's written down, which makes it a lot easier to understand.
I just remembered an example was that she was talking also about how they accuse the Middle East like societies of like sexism and homophobia to cover up like their own. So I thought that was interesting that she touched on the intersectionality.
I would give it like a 5 out of 5 because I don't normally like poetry, especially like poetry books. Like, no offense to anybody who loves poems and like poetry, but I think they can be really dull, and like a lot of times can be like fake intellectual. People read them and be like, oh my god, I'm so smart,
so
and
deep.
Not, it's like, oh my god, I'm so deep.
Maybe post this on Tumblr.
But like this one's actually like, it is deep, and you learn a lot from it. Like it's not just like you read it, it's just words that you have to like come up with your own meaning. It's still poetry, so it's still like art, and it's still beautiful, and it's like nice to read, and it has a rhythm.
I gave this specific poem a 5 out of 5 because I disagree with everything everybody already mentioned. But for her book as a whole, I think I would give it like a 4 out of 5, just based on like my own opinion and interest in like each of her poems. Some of